So what did you think of the sentencing today?
I thought that the sentencing was completely appropriate. I wish that they could get more time, actually, because of what they did to Serenity, but in line with the law, it was completely appropriate.
And just to clarify, what did each defendant get?
Ms. Garcia got 25 years to life plus 4 years for child abuse in regards to Isaiah. And then Mr. Garcia got 15 to life plus the 4 years in regards to Isaiah.
If we could just ask you to speak up just a little bit because they've got banging and stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this has got to be a relief to have this case over.
I don't know if relief is the right word, but it's been a long time coming. It's been 6 years waiting for justice for Serenity and for Isaiah. It took 2 years to find where they were in Mexico. It took 2 years to get them back here, and then 2 years for the trial. So I don't know if relief is the right word, but I'm very pleased that we're finally at this point and we finally have justice for Serenity and Isaiah.
You think this is fair?
I think the sentence is extremely fair. Serenity suffered beyond imagination. She suffered so severely. She had old scars, she had old wounds. The beating started at least 4 hours before she died because one of the injuries in her abdomen, according to the pathologist, happened 4 hours before her death, and her skull fracture happened just as she died. So I'm not saying it was necessarily a continuous 4-hour beating, but we know that it started 4 hours before she actually died and before the final injury was finally inflicted upon her little 3-year-old body. And so I think that the sentence is absolutely fair.
How important is it to prosecute these cases? I know you have the child abuse team. Why is it so important to put these people in jail?
To me, and I would hope to everybody, child abuse is so important because those are our victims that can't speak up for themselves. In Serenity's case, she's the perfect example. She had nobody to tell, and if she did, she couldn't tell because she was only 3 years old. And so I would just always encourage the public that if they see any suspected child abuse to report it, especially with these little children like Isaiah and Serenity were so small. And it's extremely important to protect these kids. They're our most vulnerable of our society and they can't protect themselves. And so it's what I do.
And this, just real quick, she was talking about how right when they knew they would be taking care of Serenity, that they would never see her again. Throughout the trial, what was that? What were you hearing on that part?
Well, there was definitely signs from other people who saw the children that they were being abused, and that's what the testimony was, that they had been abused, that Carla was particularly mean to Serenity, would hit her, would slap her, would yank her up by the arm and slap her bottom with her feet off of the ground. They both, Mr. Garcia said that he hit Serenity and Isaiah over the head with a stick. He said he saw Ms. Torres doing that as well. And in fact, Isaiah had a scar on his head that looked like had healed from being hit with something in a laceration. So there was evidence that was presented to the jury of abuse during the entire time that they had these two children.
So in that way, with that evidence, would you say that these deaths were preventable?
Well, it has to have been reported, investigated, and somebody has to have legal ground to take those children away. And that just wasn't quite there in this case. And so there was no legal ground to take them away. Is child abuse and death always preventable? In some way, yes, it is, because we would hope that we screen people and the people that see it report it, but sometimes, and particularly in this case, it slips by and nobody sees it and nobody's able to investigate it. It's not like child abuse is done, the severe child abuse is done out in public. It's done in the privacy of somebody's home. And when you have that combined with the fact that these two children couldn't speak up for themselves and couldn't tell anybody what was happening to them, then it does become somewhat unpreventable. You can't stop it.
So the abuse was never reported?
There was some reports by relatives that there was bumps and bruises on the children, but when the defendants were confronted, they said that it was just, normal 3-year-old fell down and bumped, had a bump. And at the time, that looked reasonable, that appeared reasonable. But now in retrospect, knowing everything that we know now, obviously these children were being abused.
None of that is in the CPS reports. There's no evidence that they ever reported it. That's why I asked.
Right. There's, some of the family, Ms. Hernandez, Serenity's grandmother, said that she had told the CPS worker, but again, it was just, hey, there's a bump here, there's a bruise here, and it appeared to be normal, and they appeared to have normal, reasonable explanations for those things.
With this, will anything be, or has anything been done differently with CPS?
That I don't know. That's a different department. You'd have to ask them.
Mr. Slocum, just before it said that Mr. Garcia cooperated early and often with you guys, and if he thinks it saves him 10 years. Your response to that?
That's actually not true. The case was filed back in 2010, long before we had any contact with Mr. Garcia. So the charges were filed as part of the extradition process. We can't even go start to look for them in Mexico till the case is filed, till we have a warrant, what's called a provisional warrant. So the charges that he faced in the trial were filed back in 2010, long before we talked to him. And that was based on the evidence that we had at the time, what we knew at the time, and so that was the way it was charged. And then we didn't talk to him until I believe it was about 2014 when we finally did have some contact with him just prior to his return to the States. But the time he was in Mexico, the time he first went into the prison in Mexico on our warrant, we had no contact with him and the charges had already been filed. So that's not accurate.